a bad penny. Or, well, there's no more pennies being produced, so all of them either have to be good or bad. So just before we begin, if you have anything that makes any noise, a phone, a watch, a beeper, a tablet, anything that would make noise during the talk, if you can make sure that it's not going to do that, we'd really appreciate it. The books are available at the counter, and you know, at the end of the talk, they're there, and you know, it's always nice. The reason we can do events like this is that people can come and support authors, and independent bookstores really thrive on having good communities that can support each other and support us. So we always appreciate seeing people at events and having the books here for everybody. So I am Rosie, in case you guys don't know me. I'm now a co-owner of the store. It feels very weird saying this out loud. And primarily also I'm the events coordinator, which is why I'm up here. I think one of the best things about independent bookstores and about doing author events is that you have a well of creativity and access to authors who are creative and are able to adjust and adapt and make really interesting events like this happen. So the story behind this is both these authors had people come to me differently, totally separately. They don't know each other at all, and they both proposed these books. We do now. Now you do, which is amazing, right? And they both proposed these books, and something clicked in my head, and I said, hey, well, I mean, maybe if I suggest this, they'd like to do it together. So serendipitously, they agreed, and they did manage to make this great connection. And part of this happened because of Antonia. She is how would you describe yourself?
A lover of all the arts.
That's an excellent way to
very
put it.
nice.
And she is a good friend of Annette Goodfriend, who is doing an art exhibit next door in the Alley Gallery. She's back there if you guys want to ooh and ah. I think the best things about art and the best things about books are how we can learn from many different angles. So part of why I was like, well, maybe this wouldn't work, maybe it wouldn't work, is that this is a nonfiction book and a fiction book. But I think what ties together really well is this idea of we learn from stories, we learn from true stories, and we learn from emotional gut fiction stories. So these guys are going to talk about it a lot more than I will. They know a lot more about their books than I ever could. But in this moment in time, I want everybody to think about how history resonates, how it rhymes, and how choices that we make now in ourselves can be inspired by the past and thinking about what our ancestors have done in the past and what people have lived through. So I believe the structure of the night, I don't know, Anne's going first, is that? Diane's going first. She's going to read a little from her book and discuss it a little bit, and then Anne will do it. We're going to sort of have a thoughtful questions that I'll pose, but after all of that, this is our sort of special kicker. The gallery is going to be open, and if you want to see Annette's work, you guys can take the shortcut and go out through our garden and then turn right. The Alley Gallery is right there.
And have a glass of wine.
And have a glass of wine. That's the part I always forget. Sonoma, of course there's a glass of wine. So if you guys can give them a big round of applause.
Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Thank you all for coming. I come from the Hudson Valley in New York, and it's really a pleasure to be here.
It's warmer.
Not in the morning.
All right. That's true.
So my book is called Becoming Sarah. It's about a baby born in Auschwitz who miraculously rises from the ashes and is pitched headlong into a tumultuous century ahead. It's a story of survival and the cost it takes on her daughters and granddaughters. And I'm going to start really in the beginning. A baby is born inside a war. From one unfriendly womb to another she goes. It's like living in a fishbowl. The view is panoramic, but the glass won't give. It's she who must. 1942. It happened in winter, this birth, this unlikely, uncelebrated event. A winter that so efficiently branded her with its cold, she was never not cold again. So cold that of all the things she might have wished to do over, chief among them was to have been born in summer. It happened in Auschwitz, this birth. Auschwitz, winter, Impossible for a grown-up to wake, work, sleep, and wake again. For a newborn, miraculous. The cramped barracks, the sparse water, not enough to touch an inmate's thirst, let alone fill a pot for boiling. And even if anyone could have afforded anything so dear as a pot, there would have been no fire for it to boil on. Nothing to warm an infant. Forget the mother, which she did. The mother, the face, the roughened hands she fell into, the random tits she suckled until they gave out, or she was cut off. But in March, the women of Auschwitz were twice blessed as the waning of winter brought with it a midnight move to Buchenwald, their own little suburb built of wood. As promised, work had set them free. Free as birds, 1,000 in a cage built for hundreds. A month, 2 months old, they brought the child along. What else to bring? And though they were all well defended against miracles, one stepped forward and volunteered the last corner of the slice of bread she'd stood so long in line for, chewing before spitting it into her hand and putting the pasty wad into the tiny mouth puckered like her own because it too wanted more. Tough luck. The woman was good, but no saint. It cost her nothing, though, to stick a pinky into the baby's mouth, so she did. And then, miraculously, when that first nurturing soul disappeared, another stepped in. And because in Neat's locker a baby took up little room and gave off much heat, soon there was a queue of women. That the guards never learned of this baby's existence was only one of the miracles at play. There was that she survived the winter of '42 to see another, and another, and another. That there were women enough who pooled their paltry resources and bartered rag and needle for thread and buttons, a bit of wire, a pair of shoes, and stood for a while in a cement block room, holding her, rocking under a sprinkle as ephemeral as spring rain, pretending the water ran hot and clear instead of cold and murky. A chant, loo-la-loo, rising from them, these women stripped down to their mourning dove gray. Normal babies don't see the world in Technicolor for 5 months. For this one, it would be years. 1945. Winter. 60,000 followed their German protectors away from the Eastern Barbarians' offensive. 5,000 didn't. Their choice. Those whose feet felt the treads of boots and tanks grinding toward them left. Those with feet too numb to feel anything stayed. Another self-selected mother lashed the child to her chest with great care and no less ingenuity considering the materials at her disposal. A 3-year-old, barely big enough to budge a scale, was still a grievous weight to a woman herself no more than bones and air. But it wasn't so dumb to have a little ballast and a hot canatle to cozy up to on the trek. While 2/3 of their parade slept forever in the snowbanks where they fell, this mother and child made it in mostly one piece to the train cars waiting at the border. The woman swayed with the train, burrowing deeper into the fatherland, cradling her marginally expanded girth. The burden within, her lucky charm, the girl licking ropes of snot streaming from her still bridgeless nose as she slipped through another camp's gates, an undetectable error. A timorous spring. In Bergen-Belsen, the trees insisted on budding before being told. How should they know they were prisoners too? The inmates, less rooted, suffered the cruelest time yet, every breeze torturing them with rumors of salvation, the earth beneath their feet rousing from its coma while more and more campers lapsed into their own. Auschwitz was kaput. This was no rumor. This was fact. On the night of the 14th, everyone fell asleep, as usual, to the sound of the ruffian giants barking duets with their hounds. But the next morning, there were no usuals. No crack of billy clubs, no infernal howling. Only a disturbing silence awakened them. They didn't know it was the sound of liberation. They didn't know they turned from prisoners awaiting their fate to displaced persons awaiting theirs. They knew only that the giants and hounds no longer cared what they did, and by afternoon were replaced by men in belted, brass-buttoned khakis, clean-shaven, voices sharp as whistles, aiming cameras instead of guns. The English, they were told, were soldiers too, there to nurse the sick, bury the dead, identify the living, and not a stitch more. And the inmates found pity for the fine-mannered Brits, mentioned to the core, who felt obliged to add a little oomph to the protein-deficient diet they observed. A bit of salt, a little sugar. Treats, they thought. And who could blame them for failing to anticipate how such treats would eat like acid into those unseasoned tongues? Higher-ups warned them against offering ham to those people. Yet ham was all those people wanted. They clamored for it, along with tooth powder and shoes not made of wood. Heaven's merchandise. Soon, the inhuman proportion of the campers' needs was cut down to size, only to be replaced by their wants. They wanted to gather and dance and kibitz and drink and marry and cut the foreskins of newborns and wail thanks to God or curse his name and dress up and organize and be bad with no music to face and dance to music in the minor key of their souls. And they did.
And also, thank you so much to Rosie, because it's really unusual for bookstores to have readings nowadays, so we're very lucky to be able to do this.
Are you gonna stand or move that over?
Can everybody hear me? No.
Okay, that's.
Can you hear me now?
Good. It has to be a little higher because I'm taller. There. Okay, so the book is called The Moon and Splinters, Searching for Maurice Pertschuk, British secret agent in the French Resistance. Maurice Pertschuk was my mother's brother. I knew very, very little about him growing up because like many families with war trauma, the generation that experienced it don't talk about it. The children know it's a taboo subject. And so it often takes a generation for people to do any research. And I think we're both in many ways in the same boat generation. So after my mother died, I started doing research. My uncle was 23 when he died at Buchenwald, 13 days before liberation. He was lived for a year underground and organized a large resistance network with 175 people. He was basically erased from history. And so I felt like many of you maybe feel at my age, it was time for me to be a storyteller, otherwise it would disappear. And so we did have his book of poetry. His friends in camp gathered together these little scraps of paper after he was called to the gate, and they brought them home and they were published first in 46 and then again in 2003.
When you say they were called to the gate, I don't know what that means.
In Buchenwald, when you were called to the gate, it meant you were going to be hung.
They didn't gas them, they hung them.
Well, okay, so that's another thing I learned, which I'm sure you learned. Auschwitz was a death camp, Buchenwald was a labor camp. It was not a death camp. And they worked them as slave labor, and when they were dead, they burned them in the crematorium. So it was something that we don't know very much about, and not everybody wants to look at.
It was about punishment, not about elimination of an entire group.
Yeah. So extraordinarily, these poems, they're called, his book was called Leaves of Buchenwald after Leaves of Grass by Whitman. And they are about love and about nature and about beauty. And that's one of the things that got me. So I think I can recite it, but I can also read it. Let's see. So the title comes from his poem about the moon. I opened my window and the moon blew in and crashed in splinters on the floor. I opened my window and the moon crashed in, and now she lies in splinters. I just opened the window, but she brushed me aside and slipped on my pillow, then started to slide from the bedpost to the door. Now she lies on the floor in splinters. The moon lies in my heart in splinters. The moon lies in my heart and a liquid delight ripples through the cool night. The moon lies in my heart. If I close the window, she'll be brushed away by an ugly shadow. I'll let her stay.
Wow.
So the moon to me is an image of hope, because he was a British agent in the French Resistance, and they had to learn about the moon, the phases of the moon, so when they would land in them. And so the moon, they used to call her Charlotte. She was like a goddess. And so hope, I see it as an image of hope, because what shatters and makes little glass splinters is hope. Hope shatters, right? So, okay, so this is a beginning. And it just occurred to me, they both started in 1942, because he landed in 42 and was captured in 43. So he landed on the coast of France and lived for a year underground and then was captured. So each of the chapters in the book is named after one of his pseudonyms or real names. So the first chapter is called Uncle Maurice, because in England, Maurice is Morris. And the last chapter is number 44438, because that was this number at Buchenwald. So this is Uncle Maurice. Ethel Muriel Pertschuk, my Baba, my grandmother, cut quite a figure in our New York street. Bright white wavy hair and little sapphire earrings, nubby black Persian lamb coat, a cane for navigating the bumpy sidewalks in her tippy black old lady shoes. My family lived in a tall brick building on Barrow Street in the village, apartment 5S. Baba lived in 5T, right next door. In our darkened fifth floor hallway, the gulf between apartment 5S and 5T seemed oceanic to my little girl eyes. For sleepovers at Baba's, I'd leave the known world, Danish modern furniture, books, and make the crossing to 5T carrying a little suitcase. Baba's apartment was dark, old world. Its warm air carried traces of boiled chicken and butter cookies. Her things were ornate: silver ashtray, a little letter opener, a blue cut crystal vase, mementos from her Russian Jewish jeweler father. On the phone with Auntie Spivak, she'd speak in rapid-fire Yiddish. Snap, she'd call triumphantly if she won at Snap, our favorite card game. Lying in Baba's bed evenings, I'd watch wide-eyed as she'd unhook her pink silk-boned corset. Best of all, Baba had a black and white TV. We didn't. When she spoke French to my mother, we took it, there was a show to watch, maybe Papa a raison, Father knows best. We want to watch, we'd shout. French was the language of adult secrets. My sister Karen, born in 1949, remembers Baba crying in the kitchen about Uncle Maurice, Baba explained. Years later, Karen dreamed she was in Baba's apartment, a torrent of water streaming down one wall, a wailing wall. Karen grabbed a mop, but couldn't stop the flow. Baba's tears, she realized in her dream. To me, born 2 years later, Uncle Maurice was a mysterious framed black and white face on Baba's bureau that gazed wistfully down on the action in her living room, as if he were being left out. Sometimes a candle appeared in front of the photo, flickering all day in a little jar. We never asked about the candle, or the jar, or Maurice. Not our mother, whose face in pensive moods looked just like his. Certainly not Baba. So there are lots of things to read, but I wanted to read some of the surprises, because we're talking about fiction, nonfiction, and some of the things that I called a meeting of, long story, I met many families of the people who were in the original circuit. There were 175, 17 of them were arrested, and I met a bunch of them and called a meeting in Toulouse, and they came and brought memoirs, family letters, photos, things that historians didn't have access to. So one of this comes from one of the memoirs of someone who was in Buchenwald with my uncle. And I just wanted to read this passage because it's surprising. The whole French contingent comes in cattle cars to Buchenwald. They end up in quarantine. They're for a month in the same block, they call them. And there were all kinds of people. There were a lot of writers, a lot of intellectuals, people who were in the resistance, and many of them wrote about it. So suddenly in the Buchenwald chapter, I have all these direct instances of my uncle talking and interactions. So I thought this gives you a picture of things that I wouldn't have known. So they're describing a midday meal in the block under quarantine. This is before they have to work. So Feynman is one of the people whose memoirs I read. Midday, the men sat at 10 tables, 10 men per table. Each group, a motley crew, says Feynman, quote unquote. Okay, high-level professionals, blue and white-collar workers, artisans, farmers, and others from an indefinable milieu. People who seem determined, conscious, courageous, deceitful, craven, cowardly, just to name a few. No hint of the motives that led us there. The resistance kept quiet or talked too much. The others spoke of food, women, of everything that we'd miss. I discovered on the whole a majority of listless, emaciated, resigned faces who'd be the first victims once we went to work. There were also jokers who made crude comments, reliving their years as schoolboys or soldiers with their pranks, a microcosm of society. So I think I'll leave it at that.
So one of the things when we were putting this together that I was fascinated by is when you write history and when you write historical fiction, it's hard to create a story out of history and history out of a story. So how did both of you guys handle that kind of research and that kind of writing going forward with your books?
Did you start?
Well, first of all, I felt I was way in over my head in terms of describing things that I had never experienced. So, and you've read lots of Holocaust books, so you know what people have to say about it all. But I never felt entitled to speak in my own voice, talking about Buchenwald. So that was one thing. Another is that with memory, facts are stories, people with telling their stories change. So I found that a lot of the accounts that were first-person accounts, which I wanted to rely on, first of all, I felt my author self, this is two genres. I speak as the author trying to find out what happened, and it's a mystery. And secondly, I tell the reconstructed story as I discover it. So one of the issues was, who do I believe? But I wanted the reader to believe me, so I never wanted to overstate my knowledge of the facts and leave some doubts. And that's tricky because doubts are hard on readers, right? Yet readers love mysteries. So taking the reader along to figure this out, that was one of my, and I just wanted to read this one little piece, a book by Heath, who's written about a big escape in Lithuania, and it's out in bookstores now, and it has to do with reconstructing history. And he says there's value in being confronted over and over with just how little is knowable. The truth has holes in it, and the more we cover them up, the less real the world becomes. So on the one hand, I wished I could tell the interior story of the characters, and I felt the interior story, the interiority was available in the poetry and in the stories that people told, but I didn't want to invent it, because then I would become an unreliable witness. So it's a complicated act.
Yeah.
I just wanted to read one tiny little thing. I found out this story that had been told by 3 different people differently. And one was a story that had been written 10 years after the fact by a guy who was repeating it secondhand. And the other was a woman who had been at the event, and she told it to me directly. But I found that, so I put the story out to these scholars who knew the official story, and So I say in the book, I write SOE scholars and amateurs for whom these two writers are authority figures. One man sternly corrects me. Arnaud was a radio operator. They've depended on their radio operators. Fix the radio in Montvegeau, not Fonceau. We argue. He calls in another male expert. I send them to the woman's testimony, which fails to persuade. Her facts and my facts, it seems, are the slippery, soft kind. Women, vastly outnumbered in the field, are too emotional and less reliable, as are family members who are terminally biased. I find myself whining like a girl. I say, it can't be Montvegeau, it has to be Fonceau, I was there. In other words, this whole process of his history is written mostly by men, and women's voices don't get heard, and many of the women said to me, I wasn't important, you don't need to interview me. So all of this just to say, writing history is a very complicated endeavor, and I was often envious.
Well, it's true, when you're writing fiction, you have a very different sense of responsibility. What's also true is that fiction has to be founded on truth, not necessarily fact, but truth. And I had to search for that, and so instead of writing a history and having people that I had to report their truths, I had a character that I was inventing that I can insert or impose my truth on her, my memories on her. I never, ever imagined myself writing a book about the Holocaust, and in fact, I don't really think it's a book about the Holocaust. It's a book about survival. I think we're all survivors. I started off thinking about writing a book about women and their survival techniques. One of the surprises I found in my research, and I am really not a researcher. I could never do anything like what you've done, the rigor and determination, but I read this little snippet about how all of these, most of the people a big percentage of people that came to Auschwitz were women and children, and a big percentage of them went right to the gas chambers. But of the women that survived, they tended to do much better than men because the women knew how to share. They knew how to comfort each other. They knew how to, and to me that was such a big duh, but at the same time so stunning. So I got further and further down that road, and the idea, but my people were too poor and oppressed to stick it out in Eastern Europe and wait for the Nazis to come and finish the job. They came to this country in the 19-teens, and so though I knew many survivors, I never really felt that their stories were mine to tell. I landed on, but the word survivor to me has always meant one thing, which is Auschwitz or any of the number of camps. So my goal was to try to conceive of a character that couldn't have possibly have existed, like a sort of magical realism moment. I started writing, I thought I was inventing, and then I made a visit to the DC Holocaust Memorial, and there were these amazing interviews with these people, and this elderly gentleman is talking about remembering being on a boat to Palestine. He was 6 or 7 years old. He had no idea what his name was, no idea who his parents were or what country they came from or anything. And that was just so chilling to me. And then, not long after, I stumbled on this article about a Polish midwife, not Jewish, who was interned at Auschwitz, and she delivered 3,000 babies at Auschwitz in the time she was there, and I think it was under 2 years. Only 30 of them survived out of the 3,000, but suddenly I had to reckon with the fact that my Sarah was no longer an impossible magical realism character. Her life wasn't impossible, it might have been improbable, but not impossible. And so then suddenly the weight of history kind of crashed in on me, and I settled down to do some research. And but the research, I found myself cherry picking events from history that had marked my life. Like, for instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of went right over my head when I was a kid. But the JFK's assassination and when the Berlin Wall came down are still very resonant to me. So I wasn't trying to create a perfect timeline. That had already been done anyway. There's millions of books that talk about that. I was trying to find my own personal way into it. And there was one instance, for instance, when Sarah comes to this country as a young woman, her first Thanksgiving feast it happens in New York in 1969. And I researched the day, what day, Thursday in November that was, what the weather was like. Montevani's playing on the record player, and the football teams that were playing that day. I looked up who they were. I can't remember them now, but I did look them up. And it wasn't because I had any particular fascination or interest in football, but my childhood, the roar of those football teams is just an imprint on my brain, and it just says home. And I wanted to show this character what home was, but also to impress upon the reader how, what an outsider she felt and would probably always feel. So I just went back and forth with selecting the kind of historical points that would bring that personal fleshing out.
And what's so real to me in your book is when the granddaughter begins researching her grandmother because she can't stand living with all that unspoken, and that's me, and many other people who have looked at their family secrets and so on. But yeah.
When you both talk about the impetus for your books, what made you do this?
Oh, that's a great question.
You know,
Yeah.
because it's so different,
Yes.
yet it's so similar.
Yes. Yeah. Well, my mother didn't talk about my uncle. He was a hero to all of us. He inspired all of us because he had helped get rid of the Germans in France and restore the values to liberty, equality, fraternity. You know, the values, the Vichy government values were so much like the MAGA values. It's work, patriotism, family. And they did a lot of the same things. And a bunch of people, not very many, 2% of the population, got up in France and said, we will not live with this. On top of which my uncle was Jewish and his family was at risk. But I grew up with this mystery, and it was either taboo or I needed to learn about it. And it's classic that in a family, you are the one and I am the one who needs to know more. A lot of others don't, are afraid of it. And I forgot to read this section where, there's a section in my book where I'm going through a tunnel for my first interview. I'm driving through this tunnel, I hate tunnels, I'm feeling very claustrophobic. What am I doing? I shouldn't be leaving, I'm leaving my daughter, she's about to have a baby, all this stuff. And what am I doing? And I'm getting my family in trouble. If I find out bad things, it'll all end up badly. So I was full of trepidation, but I also felt driven to know what happened. And this book is a mystery. It turns out that the historian who wrote the story got it all wrong. And what's so rewarding about doing actual history is that last year I went to Toulouse, where there were 16 other members of this group whose family had never been celebrated for this work. And we had a big 80th anniversary of liberation of Toulouse, and they came and 101-year-old woman was there, and it was the first time her father had been publicly celebrated. And these things have consequences for generations. So I was driven, I'm a researcher, I'm an academic, and I was driven to know my family's history. And yeah, but it was partly fear too. I was afraid.
You know, my journey on this started in a moment of sort of defense for my own mother, who's first generation American. Her parents had thick accents, and my grandfather started business in Akron, which is about to be 100 years old, actually, this year, I believe. My brother married a woman whose mother survived Auschwitz. She was from a wealthy Czech family, and so, of course, they stayed, not imagining that it could possibly happen there. Hint, hint, we're looking at the same thing right now. As I said, both sets of grandparents came over very early. Several of them had to come through Canada because it was so impossible to get through Ellis Island. I was stunned to learn, not even from them, but from other sources, that these trips would take months. It's not like they just got on the ship, came right here. They'd have to go to so many countries to make their way here. So anyway, my Miss Bocha, my brother's mother-in-law, her name was Vera. She was tall and strong and very heroic. Everybody adored her. I adored her. And she was, like I said, she was called a hero, basically, by everyone I thought of. My mother, on the other hand, was basically an ordinary housewife. I knew what she had survived, and that life for all of us is struggle, 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 with those moments of joy and excitement and happiness. And I kind of, in a funny way, I wanted to rectify that. I wanted to talk about women and surviving and the things that we have in common. But, so I chose this character who was a baby, touched by that experience, but not old enough to actually retain any of the memories from it. And to me, that allowed a portal into that world. But it also allowed me to explore. She didn't have to be. She wasn't strong and kind and sweet and fuzzy, and she was kind of a bitch, this character. And but the survivor population is not a monolith. I mean, they're every sort of human went through that. And some of them survived, some of them didn't. I kept wondering, like, what allows some of us to survive and forces and makes other people perish? It's like, is it strength? Is it luck? Is it God? Is it? I still don't have an answer. And the opposite of surviving, in terms of the camps anyway, was the people that died are called victims. And I thought, are they more victimized than the people that actually lived, who are traumatized the rest of their lives? And I kept thinking about it, and all I could come up with was that they're either all survivors, or they're either all heroes, or they're all victims. It's like you can't really divide that up. So the book, as I said, didn't start out as a Holocaust book. It started out about women who could survive no matter what, and didn't have to be sweet and pleasant and nice housewife or anything like that. But it turned into, I was forced to go in deeper dive, and I know, like, your dive was very, very deep. I'm so in awe of the research that you did and the commitment and the year. How long did it take you to do all this
It's
research?
about 5 years of research.
Yeah. And travel, you did a lot of travel.
Yeah, my daughter lives in Spain, so I could go to France very easily, but I went to the archives, but a lot of the interviewing the survivors was very exciting. But I have a quote in here from Primo Levi. He says, we, the survivors, are not the true witnesses. The true witnesses are the drowned, the dead, and the disappeared. And one of the things I found was that one of the witnesses who lived to tell the story, when I went and looked up all the facts of the story, he misrepresented it, and he was wrong, and he was the only witness. So I wondered about my uncle's voice, and I think, go back to your question, I think the idea of this young poet who had so much promise, and that he didn't survive. And I taught English as a second language to immigrants and refugees, and I saw so much frustrated promise and talent, and I wanted his voice to be heard. And now it is.
That's great.
Oh,
yeah.
So,
That's good.
Does anybody else have any questions for either of us, or?
Can you read a little bit more?
Read a little bit more?
Do you have
Twist my arm. Okay,
Both of you.
okay.
well, I can read that tunnel. I'll give you the tunnel, because we've all been in that tunnel. Okay, I'm on my way to my first interview with a woman named Luce Porte, who was kick-ass. She was in her mid-80s, and she had been a courier for my uncle. She'd never met him, but she knew about this guy. And I was told that she had stories. So I drove, I was in Spain, and I drove to France. The road winds through the Pyrenees to the Spanish border, a first lap in my quest to find members of Maurice's circuit. I'm en route to meet an 86-year-old former resistance courier, Luce Porte, whose contact I'd been given. Luce knew Maurice, and I was told only vaguely, if only vaguely. Blue morning light filters through the mountaintops, bouncing along red-tiled roofs of medieval Spanish towns as I head to Montréal on the French side. Montréal is right across the border in France, where my mother and her family were assigned as refugees. Montréal, a name I hear in my mother's voice, a chord in our family song of exile, hunger, bombing raids, fear of deportation, the bass notes of life for a Jewish-English family in Vichy, France. And I might add, for many people who live with it among us nowadays. The road ahead lies through the cavernous entrance to a tunnel. I hate tunnels, but there's nowhere to turn. I drive reluctantly in and quickly search for the half-moon light announcing the exit. No such luck. Sortida 5.2 kilometers, which is 3 miles, says a sign, lit by ghastly blue light. The line of cars crawls along under a dank, low ceiling. Darkness envelops the car. Ugly thoughts invade the closeness. How stupid, what on earth possessed you? My daughter 4 hours away in Barcelona, ready to give birth to my first grandchild. Such a terrible mother. Left her for what? To stir up 70-year-old ghosts? To write another tired Holocaust story? Who the hell wants that? A chorus of dreads chimes in. You can't even write. Mom would not approve. Find some shameful facts and you can't back out. You'll be trapped, suffocate, nausea, panic. I hunker down, clutching the wheel for 2 more interminable miles. When daylight finally appears, I burst out onto dappled green countryside shaken. And eventually I meet this woman who is amazing, and she takes me on this amazing journey. She calls it my pilgrimage. And she's just, I asked her questions about, I said, you were so courageous to do this. And she said, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. She told me all these stories about, you know, the codes that you, she said one time we used to roll up little cigarette papers with messages on them and put them in the tips of our gloves. And she said one time I was carrying hand grenades in my basket, and she said, that's when I was really scared. Anyway,
Wow.
just to say it was worth going through that.
I bet.
I hope this is short enough. I'm gonna skip over a little bit, and this is in 1961, when she is, obviously the camps are no longer, but she's in a displaced person camp for kind of a few years. It was another surprise to me how long those had to stay open, because nobody was taking these refugees. when Palestine became Israel, that opened some doors, but you had to have somebody, an uncle in New York or somebody in London with money to bring you over, and if you had no one like Sarah that didn't have anyone, then you were just stuck. So she is fostered by a family in Germany, not Jewish, and first with one family that's very kind, and then is put into a home that is not so kind. And this is the end of her stay there. Sarah had no prayers of her home. She had dreams, not the kind that made you stupid with hope, but the kind that loomed in dark attics and made you know things you shouldn't, like that no ground is so firm it will remain underfoot forever. When the families of Sele awoke to their new order, she alone was prepared. It happened on a summer Sunday, August 13th. First, she prepared the Weisses' breakfast. While their tea steeped, she prepared herself. She was no thief. She gathered what she'd come with, a valise monogrammed in gold, a portrait of a family called Vogelman. This was the first family she stayed with. A crumpled scrap of paper, the only thing attesting to her before. In exchange for the clothes on her back, she left one of the 17 Deutschmark she'd earned over the previous 4 years doing chores for neighbors. The same neighbors who would claim no surprise over her sudden departure, telling Weiss he was lucky to be rid of her, a girl who stared at the floor when spoken to and never returned a smile. What she had of her own to give, the braid that tickled her back, she cut off at the root with Frau Weiss's meat shears. Frau Vogelmann's tortoiseshell clasp biting its frizzled end. This she left in the top drawer, the dresser drawer by Weiss's bed. See, I haven't rehearsed this part. Wiry as a horse's tail, it had been harder to scissor through than she'd expected. She knew it wouldn't bring much at market, but told herself it was fair enough compensation for the little prayer book she suddenly couldn't bear to leave behind. In the parlor, the gentleman of the house and his wife, like every villager, were in front of their radio, teary and desperate for this staticky report to tell them that it wasn't true, that their beloved capital had not been desecrated, sliced through the heart by an impenetrable wall. And neither noticed Sarah, her chopped hair, or the breakfast trays she'd brought them, tea, strong and sweet, and yesterday's biscuits, or her exit to the broadcast severing blows, a symphony of opportunity to her ears. That's the Berlin Wall assault, which doesn't start out as much of a wall, it's just a little bit of barbed wire, basically. So that the book kind of gallops through. It covers 100 years from 1942, a little more than 100 years, to 2045. And so I try not to dwell too long in any, but it goes by the calendar, not every single year, but it leaps and bounds to try to keep a good pace. Time for book buying and wine, signing and whining.
Very good. Good job, ladies.